All right, thank you. So we're okay? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is John. I guess I know some of you. So if you want to reach me online, that's where I'm at. I'm May Trollback. Okay, so I was hoping to just have like a very brief conversation about some of the things that are happening in the Asia-Pacific region. And my context for that is I've sort of spent half my adult life living in the region, and I'm kind of like a business guy at Consensus, so I do a lot of work in the region. And for a while now, I've been feeling like we're sort of missing the broader context. And I think there's some like incredible business applications and opportunities that we should be considering in the region. So I'm going to break it down into like Japan, China, and Asia Pacific. I kind of have a basic slide deck here, but we'll just talk through some of this stuff. So I think Japan is a really interesting place to start. Very often it's underrated, or rather it's difficult to understand what is happening because it's such an insular market. It is sort of like, from a macro perspective, experiencing some tremendous change. Some of you may have heard of like the demographic shifts that are happening. People are like living longer, and they're sort of like not reproducing. And now Japan is transitioning towards like sort of a more open policy and a more heterogeneous society. So within that, there has been this notion of quantitative easing for quite some time now. Effectively, the Japanese government has been pumping a lot of money into the economy, and many people will sort of argue that this is potentially unsustainable. And I would argue that based on sort of my, I guess, anecdotal experiences in the country over the last few years, there are many very sophisticated people in the financial sector and otherwise that sort of view our technologies and some of the solutions we're proposing as potentially one way to offload some of the systemic risk that seems to be accruing. And so that's kind of one element I think is really important. Certainly if you're thinking about building financial applications or infrastructure that supports financial applications. Another thing to consider is deregulation. Japan has historically been a fairly conservative country. In recent years, again, because of demographics, shifting economic and technology landscapes, this is changing. So not only in the financial sector, but in the energy sector, a year and a half ago, the Japanese government deregulated. So they're sort of liberalizing the market. And just to give you context, TEPCO, which used to be sort of the big energy utility monopoly, has since lost more than 1.5 million customers because they were like so inefficient at many things. And consequently, there's lots and lots of innovation in that space, and part of that is actually whether it's things like Energy Web Foundation, which is doing some spectacular work in terms of connecting utilities, and so you can like share data, and you can sort of have a system that more elegantly describes what is actually happening in the market, to even things like Grid Plus partnering with TEPCO, and so these solutions are being rolled out, and likewise in the financial sector. One of the big things that happened, I don't know that we sort of thought about it very much in our industry, is the FSA is sort of now allowing non-bank entities to handle money transfers. And this is kind of like a key obstacle that we used to face. So if you're thinking about these markets with respect to Japan, think in terms of deregulation, and I think within that there's just tremendous opportunities. And so the shifting demographics and opening markets, this was another kind of big one. There's this entire API layer that's sort of being developed across the Japanese financial sector. And actually, when you sort of live in Japan and interact with the financial system, you realize that, like, despite the fact that Japan is so high-tech and living in the future, there's just a lot of room for optimization. Okay. This was like, I saw this headline. I don't know if it's true or not, but it comes from Nomura. And I definitely know from my experiences that certainly when there was a lot more like euphoria and sort of enthusiastic trading activity, that we saw tremendous activity, tremendous growth in Japan. And in fact, it is sort of by far the biggest market from that perspective in our sector. So what can you do? Like go to Japan and make friends with people. That's a really good one. I think Vitalik and others, I mean, we've all sort of done events and conferences there. Community management is a big one. Like definitely hire, whether it's like spectacular projects, like I'm a big fan of, for example, the Gollum project. I would say that's the kind of sort of project and group that could really benefit from sort of having people that speak the language and that can produce content. There's a general lack of content in Japan. Pretty much most of the stuff that reverberates locally is sort of like translated from content that originates in the West. And yeah, and then some of the stuff we talked about earlier, just think about go-to-market strategies. Like, are you going to launch a product? If so, do you have like a target location or target market in mind? And I would say like Japan could be probably at the top of your list if you sort of dig into it a bit. Okay, so then we go to China. This is kind of like China before like the Bitcoin ban and all of the sort of regulatory activity. And then we had like a bunch of funny projects and actually lots and lots of innovation. So one of the things that I think is sort of a big misconception that we have as Westerners, it's something I learned over time. I've been fortunate enough to live in China, and I'm not making a political commentary or anything like that. No system is perfect. However, it is the case that the Chinese government is pretty much engineers and researchers and technocrats. And historically, the trend has been sort of new emergent technologies come into the play, and so the government, once they realize, once they figure out how to implement it within their strategic goals and initiatives, then everything just opens up. And so I think this is probably a more accurate mental model to build around this stuff. And so, another thing I've learned is, well, we have lots of really talented engineers in our ecosystem, and many of us have like sort of built products, and some of us have products that hundreds of people use, okay? And we think we're great. Well, there's lots of these Chinese developers. These people have built products that like tens of millions of people use. So the state of like, innovation that's happening at scale is incredible. And I think this is probably sort of where a lot of our mental models break down and we don't necessarily see what's really going on there. Okay, so from a capital markets perspective, this is one thing that is very much sort of happening now in the background. There are thousands of companies that are thinking about how to put equity, stocks, bonds, all kinds of structured finance products, all kinds of things that companies do on the blockchain. I think this stuff is going to come at a sort of epic scale, in an epic wave, and it's something that we're sort of almost like maybe not, we don't have too much good visibility on it. And then finally, just thinking about the rest of APAC, Asia Pacific. So it is, I would say in terms of addressable market, the most dynamic market in the world. We have economies throughout the region. Like in the United States, people are so like ecstatic about like 2% growth. I mean, it's unbelievable, 2% growth. And these are countries that are growing at 7% real GDP for like the next 20 years. That's sort of one consideration. A second consideration is I think you can be a lot more impactful, okay? So you can do things, and again, I know I'm kind of skewing more on the financial use cases side, but let's say from that perspective, you can do things like build really cool products that maybe us technocrats use, or that large institutions like Goldman Sachs use to make even more money. Or you can do stuff like build infrastructure that connects like tens of millions of people to financial services that otherwise aren't available. So projects like I2I are doing that. There's another project called Coins. These guys are like the Coinbase of sort of Asia, if you will. I think that's an old slide. I think they have like 7 or 8 million customers, and people just don't realize the scale at which we're seeing like tremendous adoption and traction. And then you're sort of seeing all of these other components, developments in different parts of the world, different parts of the region. One other place I really wanted to highlight was Vietnam. I've been very fortunate to spend a bunch of time there. Just incredibly talented people, lots and lots of great technical resources and developer communities. And this is a interesting mindset. I think is important to highlight, where historically capital allocation has been sort of hard or very expensive or very difficult to come by in these regions. And for better or worse, I mean, obviously some of the things that have happened on Ethereum have been pretty spectacular. Others have been like huge sort of scams. But the sort of allocating capital, or at least access to capital, the bar and the difficulty with which these regions have faced in the past has certainly changed. And so these developer communities are thriving, and I would encourage you all to also consider Vietnam as well. Cool. So I know it's the end of the day. I won't take up any more time. I guess if there's any questions, but thank you.
Question. Is there any well-established like infrastructure, like project for dealing with the counterparties in these countries using smart contracts and cryptocurrencies? Like if you want to buy something from there or sell something there? Yeah.
So so there are a bunch of services and products you can use. One kind of, I don't know, cliche use case is like the remittance side of it, and there's so many different projects that are tackling that. It's like very, very easy to do things like send money over there or pay bills or whatever. The stuff I'm more interested in, to be honest, is, when you look at a country like the Philippines, for example, 100 million people, most heterogeneous population in Asia that natively speaks English, that's projected to be a top 20 country in the next 25 years. Yet there's only ever been 2 securitizations in its entire history. So there's like no structured finance products. It's very hard to get exposure to like tremendous high yield opportunities, whether it's in real estate or otherwise. And those types of projects are, the opportunities are coming. I think there's lots and lots of really interesting infrastructure platforms, whether it's like a Melonport, or if you look at applications like the French guys here building Doriel. So I would imagine as we keep moving forward, that in particular is going to be very, very interesting. So entering into sort of service agreements, being able to purchase access to high yielding opportunities, and all of that sort of like a very convenient, accessible, easy way. Yes, sir. Are there any banks that have launched custodian services for crypto assets? So yes and no. You have had like very prestigious institutions like Nomura in Japan make comments, and I think Mitsubishi as well. The extent to which they've actually deployed, I'm not sure. There are other smaller banks like Nippon Wealth Bank in Hong Kong, which is launching something with Trustology. So that component is happening very, very quickly. I'm still not sure how I really feel about like banks having custody over like crypto, but it is certainly fair to say that if we're going to like optimize the world of structured finance in these emerging markets, and if we think our technologies can like sort of do that, then one mandatory regulatory component will be custody. So the answer is maybe not yet, but like very soon, yeah. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Well, yes, sir.
Okay, so one kind of paramount feature of, I would say, the Ethereum community or similar, blockchain systems is the idea of governance. Thank you. Is the idea of governance, and a lot of these discussions that we're having are based on primarily Western institutions. So I thought your slide about China's, technocratic elite, if you will, driving the development of these applications at an exponential rate. I'm wondering, in the long term, do you think that in terms of scalability or mass adoption, that the focus on governance and the focus on how do we make sure everything's fair and everyone has a say
if the lack of that, in some cases, is what's driving this acceleration?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So it is not the case that our, I don't know, Western neoliberal ideals are shared everywhere, because that tends to go into things like governance when we build systems. And so when you look at places like, I don't know, Korea or China or many of these parts of the world where they have like, they sort of subscribe to Confucius teachings. I mean, Japan is like very hierarchical. And when you go into the corporate structure there, you have this like singular unified force that gets applied to very hard problems or whatever things they're targeting in the market, and it's kind of like effective and it works. So in other words, governance is certainly going to be a really hard and interesting challenge. I think the successful projects will be the ones that like take into account maybe nuances in local markets. But yeah, totally. I mean, there's sort of lots and lots of opportunities to innovate there, and maybe you know, with a bit of a mindfulness towards like, you know, maybe not you know, sort of applying our viewpoints on things like that and responding to the market instead. Okay, thank you.